No, that's the wrong screen. There we go.
Perfect.
All right. Okay. So today's topic, we're going to be talking about ableism. And this is also a sale for like a future, like extended topic that I'll be talking about. So what is ableism? So ableism is the discrimination of and prejudice against people with disabilities. And this is based on the belief that having a disability means that you're better, or like, I'm sorry, the belief that not having a disability means that you're better or superior. And it also assumes that a disabled person requires some type of fixing. And it also defines the person by their disability. And so ableism really classifies people with disabilities as a less than. And ableism includes things like harmful stereotypes, misconceptions, and generalizations of people with disabilities. So when we say someone has a disability, we look at if they have difficulty with daily tasks due to physical, emotional, or mental health difficulties that substantially limit one or more of their major life activities. And so when we're looking at the areas that can be limited, we're looking at how is their sensory system affected? What is their mobility like? What is their problem solving or cognitive skills? What is their self-care skills? And then when they're over the age of 15, what does their independent living skills? So we're gonna review some research from about children in the American Community Survey. And these responses were based off of self-report and not based off of having a specific medical diagnosis. So we're looking for children who have differences in their sensory systems. So think about like their vision, their hearing, and all of these other areas that we have listed here. Differences in their mobility, cognitive, self-care, independent living skills. So one of the things that we first know from looking at the research is that disability rates have been rising since the 90s. Now, some of this may not be due to actual people becoming more disabled, but more about our awareness of people actually having disabilities, increasing the categorization of what is included or who is included in disabilities, and having better tracking methods. Now, in 2019, 2.6 million households had at least one child with a disability. And we know that that's risen in terms of the overall amount of people identified with children with disabilities has risen from 3.9 to 4.3%. And while that may look like a little number, that's over 3 million children. And when we looked at those like disability areas that I was talking about in terms of like the independent living skills and all that, the most common disability that we see is cognitive. And so when we're saying cognitive, we're talking about a kid's problem solving skills, or if they were going up for a test, like an assessment, it's the results of like going through some level of like IQ testing. So one of the things that we know is in terms of disability rates, when we look at it by race and ethnicity, that we see the highest rates of disability among Indigenous Americans and the lowest rates among Asian Americans. And when we also look across socioeconomic statuses, children in poverty have the highest rates of disability. And so when we look across the United States in terms of regions, the South in the Northeast parts of the United States had the highest levels of disability, while out West had the lowest. So now I want to talk about some of the microaggressions that people who are disabled face. And I want to admit and acknowledge that prior to doing like this type of research, it was just really surprising to me how much of this stuff felt like really common, how many of these things that I know that like I've seen and heard, and how before doing like this specific work about thinking about like how important language is and how like language shapes not only like our beliefs and how we see people, but also how people see themselves. Like some of these microaggressions that we're going to go over are just things that are just, I feel like just so common to just kind of like everyday kind of like casual conversation. So are you off your meds? That's is something that I don't think of in terms of like when, as I said, I was doing the research, I really had to like think about that because I could totally see that as something that I've said to somebody or could or would say to some, well, now I wouldn't. Now I'm actually trying not to say these things, but just recognizing like that this is something that I would have said. You're so crazy. And so if we actually want people to come into mental health treatment, how does like saying things like you're so crazy, like what does that make them think about? What is it like to have like any type of mental health difficulties? My ideas fell on deaf ears. So that's a microaggression to the deaf community. It's basically saying that they can't understand information. And one of the things that was associated with deaf people in the past was the saying deaf and dumb. So there was this assumption because we have a society that is developed for hearing people, that because you have more difficulty in hearing, that is like related to like your problem solving abilities. And so that's kind of like where this saying comes from. You're acting so bipolar today. So I have a lot of friends who are actually bipolar, and they talk about like how much like this bothers them and how like statements like this got in the way of them actually seeking treatment because it makes it like really negative to have like manic episodes. Like that is generally like what they're talking to me about, is like the mania aspect that's associated with bipolar, and how that like is kind of like made fun of. And so a lot of them really rejected being able to accept their diagnosis because of like the cultural idea about what does that mean. Casting a non-disabled person as disabled. One of the things that you look at is the research is disabled people have difficulties actually getting jobs. And it is one of the things about being having cultural humility, which will be a topic I'll be talking about next month. But cultural humility is about recognizing that even me, Kynetta, like if I did a lot of, if my focus of work was on like Black males, if I came up into a conversations of Black males talking, they still have like everyday lived experience that likely does not trump like my reading experience. So casting a non-disabled person not only like is not equitable in terms of disabled people do not have equitable access to jobs, but also there's the aspect of the disabled person's real life experiences could totally be informing that character. There are a lot of things that when you're not of a certain culture, that it's very easy for you to very easily miss. And so often you will hear disabled people talking about that they can tell that this like thing was not written by a disabled person because they would have taken like this into account. Framing someone disability is super inspirational. Like, oh my goodness, like it is so cool that you have autism and you have a degree, or like it is so awesome that, I mean, that you're doing so much with your cerebral palsy. And so really like making it that people have like created over like these jumps and like bounds is like very like disrespectful, because generally these people are just living their everyday lives in no way that's different than you do. They do have an extra challenge, but again, it feels very disrespectful to make your everyday life experiences like you're such a good person for just living your everyday life experience. Having non-accessible bathrooms. So that's like a microaggression that a lot of people don't like recognize or see. In terms of thinking about like accessibility, I had to apologize this week to one of my deaf clients because I do like lots of facial expressions, like as my way of like communication. And I was telling her, like, I have to apologize to you because I realize I have not been doing effective communication. I am communicating through my facial expressions and not explaining what my face is doing out loud. I have to do a lot better at communicating. So we often live in a society where we have accessibility for what we think most people use. And so it's definitely a microaggression not to have accessibilities. So what are some of the ways that we can actually show allyship? So first thing, we need to believe people when they disclose that they have a disability and not go through the whole thing of like questioning, because that often happens to people if like your disability doesn't like look in the way that they think that it should. And so often you'll get questioned based off of people's perception of like what your disability means. And then people often do like, again, give microaggressions like, but you perform so well. Like when they're asking you these questions. The next thing that we want to make sure that we're not doing is assuming. So don't assume that somebody is faking their disability because you don't know what it is. Don't assume that you know what somebody's needs is. It's one of the things that why it's really important to have disabled people being able to play themselves in roles, because with that lived experience, they are actually the experts in more understanding the needs of their community. Don't touch people's disability equipment without their permission. So while you may be wanting to be helpful, somebody wouldn't come grab my leg. And so for a lot of people in terms of being disabled, their disability equipment is an extension of their body. So the same respect that I would have to somebody else's body is the same respect that I should give to somebody's disability equipment. So one of the things that we really need to think about, and it's something that often disabled people deal with, is people asking them invasive questions about like their disability. So really think about like, why are you asking those questions? And most likely the answer is for your own curiosity. And so the answer is, yeah, you need to kind of keep that question to yourself. So one of the things that we want to make sure that we're doing is to not speak on behalf of somebody with a disability unless they explicitly ask you to. So I wouldn't talk about somebody else's disability without their like express permission to do so. So it's not my job. Like, well, I'm very open with like my ADHD, but if I knew that another professional also had ADHD because we were talking about their difficulties, I wouldn't get in the middle of a meeting and talk about I don't know, Sarah's ADHD too. So it's not on me to talk about somebody else's disability, even if I'm aware of it, even if I'm aware of the difficulties that it could be causing in their environment. It's not for me to talk about their disability. So think about like your accessibility, like when you're planning like events. So like one of the things that I've been thinking about, like after especially like my experience of working with a visually impaired client is like my use of facial expressions. And if I am using a facial expression to get something across, that I also need to like verbally do it. One of the things that you may see at the bottom of your screen is captions. I put captions like automatically, like as a thing on side of my, you can set it inside of your PowerPoint so that captions always show up. So I just have captions there like all the time. And so now another thing I got to think about is if I'm communicating with facial expression, that I need to actually like use some like verbal words to follow that up. And then talk about it. So one of the biggest things is to talk about like disabilities with children and young people, in terms of making it more normal, recognizing that having a disability is very common for like members of our community, teaching them like in terms of some of these rules, in terms of it's really important to like know these rules. And these are all ways that we can all increase our allyship. And so here are the references. And I want to thank you for your attention. You can email me if you have any questions, and we have a little bit of time here if anybody has specific questions. But I do want to shout out a new training that I have coming up through the Center of Innovative Practices. It'll be updates on neurodiversity with a focus on autism. And so we will be also having a piece of this conversation in that training, because ableism is definitely something that affects those who have neurodevelopmental disorders. And if you're not sure what that is, then you should come to the training.
Sugar, do you know where the actual word ableism came from to describe?
No, I do not know what specifically where the word came from. Hold on, let me go ahead. Because often my notes have, let me stop share. Let me see if I have it written in my notes, because often my notes have more information than I necessarily have in my head. I know it came out of the disability community, but I can see if I have who specifically came up with it.
I just thought it was a little misleading as you described it, but could have been how I was interpreting ableism. So I just wondered if you had a little historical knowledge of the word.
No, I do not, past that, in terms of that it came out of the disability rights community.
Okay, thanks.